Well, in the interest of time, we might as well get started, everyone. Welcome to the session on social dynamics for data interoperability interest group. You'll see on the chat there, Stephanie's put the collaborative notes. So I'd encourage everyone to go in there and if you can add your details in there so we know who attended. And also as we're going through, if you can put any notes down in there, that'll be really great. Welcome. It's been great to have everyone joining us today. So today we're going to run through, initially through a brief introduction to social dynamics and what this group is about. And hopefully we don't have any trouble with the platform. Pretty confident with it now in using it, but presenting on that can be but hopefully all goes smoothly. So the agenda, which you can hopefully see in the on the screen now, we'll just run through some introductions about what social dynamics group is about, and then we got 3 different talks from Oscar, who's going to talk about some of the interoperability frameworks in EOS. Priyanka, who's going to talk about the inequalities of data, and Hannah is going to talk about some of the lessons that were learned from COVID pandemic. So before we forget, this session is being recorded. So if you have any issues with that, just be aware of that. So and we want this to be an interactive session as we're going through. So at the end of the conversations, we do like people to interact, ask questions, and so on. So use the chat and ask and the Q&A, and we'll be moderating that and trying to answer the questions as we go through. All right. So social dynamics of data interoperability. So why do we need to have a focus on social dynamics? So this group came about because there was a recognition that after many years of working on data, that the data that lives in business units and in projects, and it's still very hard to get the data out and make use of the data. And the data lives in very complex ecosystems, and the data supply chains can have a mix of formal and informal arrangements that allow access to it and to do the interoperability between them. I come from Australia, so a lot of the examples in here are from there. These are some of the diagrams I've captured around people having mapped out the data ecosystems in different disciplines. And you can see that there are lots of interactions, a lot of organizations involved, a lot of groups involved in there. And while we address a lot of the technical challenges through standardizations and various ways, we have the technology and the data sits in the context of organizations and people. And as much as we talk about the data interoperability and the technology interoperability, if we don't have the people and the organizations that are able to interoperate, then it causes a challenge to actually achieving some of those the objectives of having data and technology interoperate. So if you look around the place over the years, you'll see that there's been lots of recognition that some of the really challenging areas are in the social aspects of it and the cultural aspects of it. So and recently there's recognition that there's a third wave of open data is starting to emerge. It's and that is looking around that purposeful use of data and the collaborations for the data holders and the data users. And again, under that, all those become much easier if there is the ability for the different groups to work together and interoperate there. And so, for example, as a very simple example in here, most people will be fairly knowledgeable in the Gartner hype cycle for technology. If you map the service management models around that, you'll find that on the left-hand side in the early days, models like Agile work quite well. As things get a bit more mature and bigger and more complex, frameworks like SAFe start to make more sense, which is still flexible, but also have some governance and rigor around it. And as things get to really the mature stage of the technology, you start to see models like ITIL being more applicable in there. If you then map that into the different types of people, you start to have this concept of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. Pioneers, people are really great people who can really see new opportunities, new connections. They're the ones who can innovate and see what can be done next. The settlers can have a mentality that they can take things and really see how to make it and usable for the masses. And town planners have that special skill that they can take things and scale it to and make it really robust and reliable. And they're the ones who can take things and make it fade into the background. We just assume that they run. Each of those people have different traits, and you can imagine that if you had town planners in the early stages, things just would not work too well. At the same time, if you had the pioneers or the mindset in mature technology, they'll always be tweaking things and improving things, compromising the scalability and reliability. So being able to do all of that, being able to pay attention to that and knowing that those things, when to apply those and when to not, is useful. When you think about the social aspects, we're talking about the institutional dynamics, the social dynamics, the economics that fall around it, the governance, all those things. They all come together along with the technology to be able to make the best out of what we're trying to do in having globally connected data, accessible data. The observation also is that we, over time, spend in many projects and activities solving the same problem in different ways. And there are patterns that do emerge. And there hasn't been any real concerted effort around capturing those patterns and describing them sufficiently so that we can reuse them. So people learn through experience or looking at other things. But it's really hard to come by, and there's no body of knowledge around those things. So in summary, that the data and technology interoperability we've had a lot of focus on. Described, they all sit around in that surrounded by their social and institutional context, and having interoperability across all three layers makes sense. And this group is focused on the things that matter in that outer layer of social and institutional economic context. So the idea of the group is to then try and map some of those out and be able to pull together a body of knowledge that can be used by the others as we go forward. All right. Oh, sorry. That's from the charter, so it's to be able to organize and, as I said, bring that body of knowledge together, and also to see if we can identify a set of useful case studies to illustrate the point and be able to reuse that. Okay, I might stop there and see if there are any questions around that before we move on to the next phase. So any questions on that? If you got any questions, you want to either unmute yourself and ask, or put it up on chat. All right, there are no questions. Must have done a brilliant job then. Okay, next up we got Oscar Kosher, who's going to talk to us about the EOS interoperability aspects. So he was part of the EOS interoperability framework group, and I'll hand it across to him to explain. And Oscar, did you want to take over and share?
Let me see if you can see me now.
Yes, we can.
And I hope also that you can see now my presentation. Mm-hmm.
Yes, all good.
Okay, perfect. So good morning, everybody, or wherever we are, all of us. So I mean, like when Karen was commenting me, can you do a presentation on the work that you did on the EOS interoperability framework, specifically on the organizational interoperability? I said, well, I mean, like probably this was the one that was a little bit less advanced in all the work that we did, but I mean, I will be happy to present this because probably this will raise interesting discussions, interesting conversations in this context. So I will try to do this presentation in the time that you have assigned to me. And especially, I mean, I would like to also acknowledge, I mean, like all the contributions that were done by the FAIR Working Group Interoperability Framework Task Force, yeah, all the members who were participating over there. So let's go into the general presentation. I mean, what is the objective? Basically, to give you an overview of all the work that we have done in these last 2 years on delivering the EOS interoperability framework, and specifically with a little bit more detail on the organizational interoperability challenges and recommendations that are included in that document. A little bit of context first. I mean, I'm sure that probably many of you are already aware of, I mean, how all these work a little bit, but I mean, in general, just to give you like a little bit of context, during the last 2 years, there were several working groups associated to the EOS Secretariat, which were focusing on different aspects of how to define, I mean, those next steps for the European Open Science Cloud. More specifically, I was part of the FAIR working group, and over there were 4 task forces on fair practice, metric certification, PADs, and specifically on interoperability. And this is the one that I'm going to be talking about. In terms of timeline for 2020, I mean, I could say that there were 2 main deliveries, yeah, from our task force. One around June 2020, where we delivered the first version out for comments, for public comments of this interoperability framework. That was the first draft. And then by the end of December, indeed, I mean, in the end, it was in the end of January, we delivered this final version of the interoperability framework, which is the one that I will be talking about. So what is the organizational interoperability in the context of EOS? I'm not sure whether you are familiar with this view that is appearing in the Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda of the European Open Science Cloud, which is basically talking about the main elements that will be part of the minimum viable ecosystem for EOS. And basically, I'm with the really minimal components that are completely necessary, some of them on authentication and authorization. I mean, many of these elements that we need in order to start looking for data sets, looking for software, looking for research objects, research outputs, and so on. Then over there, we will have the service and data providers. This is what people are working currently on. And at that layer, additional layer, we have the EOS interoperability framework, where we are talking about technical, semantic, organizational, and legal interoperability. And I will go a little bit further on why we decided on having these distinctions. From here, we will have all these elements, yeah? Services, as we have over here, services, software, publications, data, and so on. And then, I mean, there will be, or we expect that there will be different types of services in EOS Exchange, which is more or less like the marketplace, yeah, that we could be using. This is yet another view, and I'm not going to go in details on that one. I mean, you will have it available as well with the slides, where the EOS interoperability framework is also, again, I mean, like provided as a middle layer that gives like this or provides this relationship between the EOS resource providers and those ones or those that are providing services and functions on top of them. Yeah, so it is like that magic layer that should solve everything across communities and across organizations. Yeah, and I mean over here, when I say magic, it's really that, I mean, there are plenty of requirements that we have there. Yeah. So if you're interested in the document that we produce, that's the URL where the document is available. You can just look for EOS Interoperability Framework, European Commission, and it will appear. So you will have it there. And I mean, I will just go now, I mean, into the details. I mean, like the very specific details that I to discuss today over here. So the first thing is could be to say that the EOS Interoperability Framework is based on work that had been already done on the European Interoperability Framework, yeah? Mostly focused on public administrations and how they can deliver services across Europe. And over here, we have 4 layers that are clearly identified. The technical one, where we have the frameworks, the infrastructure providers, the services, the semantic interoperability layer that, I mean, all of you, I mean, attending RDA are quite familiar with. I mean, and it includes metadata, ontologies, the interpretation of the meaning, structure of all the data assets that we have, and so on. Then the organizational interoperability, which is more focused on the governance, on the rules of participation, on the policies that have to be considered. And finally, the legal interoperability part, which we subcontracted to a in that area. And I think, I mean, that also the results that are in the document are pretty interesting, where we are talking about copyright, licenses, data protection, GDPR, and all the typical issues that appear when we are talking about sharing data and resources in the context of EOS. So in this context, yeah, which is what we understand by organizational interoperability? Well, basically the way in which organizations, I mean, in this whole ecosystem, could align all their processes, their responsibilities, the expectations, so that we can really have these mutual beneficial goals. Yeah, this was the main definition that we were using over here, and this was like the main elements that we were considering when making this proposal. Yeah. So I'm not going to take much time on explaining you, I mean, the table of contents of the document, but basically just to tell you that we discuss on the interoperability layers, specifically on the organizational interoperability. We try to identify challenges, problems, needs, and provide some recommendations in order to address or to check, I mean, which are the recommendations to achieve interoperability in this area. I mean, they are very general recommendations. I mean, we didn't want to go into, I mean, too many details on some of them. And the only part that we addressed a little bit more probably was the one related to semantic interoperability, where we have a specific part of the document that is actually focused on describing the fair digital objects, how we are associating metadata to the different elements, and even crosswalks across the different metadata models. So this is for, I mean, this would be very interesting for any other RDA session. I will now focus on the organizational interoperability part. Yeah. So that's it. The concept of fair digital object is one that, I mean, is quite common across also, I mean, in the context of RDA, where we have, I mean, like our object, and we would have a metadata onion, yeah, where we are attaching metadata from different communities, from different perspectives. And again, I mean, when we are talking about organizations, we will see, I mean, what would be like that type of metadata that we would be looking for. Yeah. So moving now into organizational interoperability, what are the main topics that we were addressing that are in relationship with the discussion today? First of all, I think that, I mean, that there is a need to discuss a little bit more on which are the processes, yeah, that are being followed by the different organizations that are participating in EOS, especially when they are providing services. Services in a very general manner, yeah, services, data, catalogs, crosswalks, semantic frameworks, whatever it is needed over there, yeah. Again, I mean, another aspect that we were considering is who is responsible for providing common interoperability services as well. I mean, we have an interoperability framework, which are the organizations that are going to be providing those services that are key for interoperability, like service catalogs, registries, common PID services, and so on. And we ran a set of interviews with people from European research infrastructures, from ESFRIs, from different research communities. And it was quite clear for them that, I mean, like, still there was this idea of the burden of providing sufficient metadata, and especially when it goes even further, yeah, than just providing the metadata to allow your data to be searched or your services to be found, yeah. So in principle, I mean, this was like the clear agreement that we had from the interviews that we were running, and from here we derive like the main ideas of the main problems, yeah, that could be summarized in these 4 main points, yeah. First of all, that there was not yet a clearly defined governance structure for EOSC. That's quite clear. I mean, we are in the process of creating this governance structure. Now, I mean, like, everything is set up in the association, and I mean, it will start being a little bit more clear. That there was not a clear description of terms and conditions, acceptable usage policies for the services that were being provided, and this, I mean, generates problems. I mean, it generates clear needs when we are talking about this type of organizational interoperability. There is another working group that was working on rules of participation, which is actually like focusing or giving the feedback to this governance structure and terms and conditions, service level agreements, and so on. But those documents at the time when we were proposing the interoperability framework, they were not sufficiently clear. They didn't have enough details to really go into an organization like mine, I mean, like my university at UPM, and just saying, okay, these are the rules, yeah, that you have to follow. And in general, there was also a clear indication that there was a lack of knowledge about the sustainability policies, the robust long-term funding plans for many of the services that are provided. These were identified as the main problems that we had to deal with, yeah? So the main needs, yeah, that can be derived from these problems are related to having a clear governance framework, where we understand also for the other levels of interoperability, which are the instructions, the considerations, the services that we have to have, and how they have to be handled. One aspect that appeared was the need for even having permanent organization names and functions, yeah? Something that looks very simple. I know that there are efforts in that respect, and having registries of research funding organizations, research performing organizations, and so on. But we are still in that situation where this is not completely clear yet, yeah? Again, I mean, like service level agreements, we need documents that describe this, and that describe this in a machine-readable format as well, so that in the same way as we are talking about licenses that are machine-readable, we need this to be machine-readable as well, yeah? And finally, we would need also some types of mechanisms for interoperability certification, yeah? So that service providers can provide or set their own expectations on the support of interoperability for those services. I think that these were the main needs, yeah, that we were identifying, and with this, we were providing a set of very simple recommendations. Basically, some of them have been already taken into account, like in the rules of participation documents, where we were saying, okay, I mean, you have to include interoperability over here and typical interoperability services. The same is applicable directly for services, okay? We really need to understand very clearly, in order to ensure organizational interoperability, what are the data formats, the vocabularies, the metadata, the level of quality of the different organizations, and which are the expectations that they can provide to others. And finally, I mean, this idea of having a permanent organization names and functions that we can use in the same way as we are doing for data sets or services or other types of resources. So these were the main recommendations that we came up with. There is much more detail on the documents. I just wanted to summarize with this table that you could find in, you'd be able to find in the executive summary of the document, where we have like general recommendations for the 4 layers, for the technical layers, the semantic layers, where we are talking about semantic artifacts, and organizational and legal. Yeah, legal, they seem to be quite a lot, but I mean, there are plenty of small things that have to be considered, but I mean, in general, I mean, it's more or less equivalent to the recommendations that we are providing in the other layers. So this is like the main output of this task force inside the FAIR working group. And I mean, I hope that, I mean, that have been on time, that have provided you an overview of all the work that we were doing, and also, I mean, the very specific focus on this organizational interoperability. And I'm happy to answer any questions or to participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Oscar. That was great to hear. Does anyone have any questions? Oscar, I had a question on this one. When you talked about rules of participation, what came out of that? Can you describe what kind of things were considered in there as important?
Okay, so I mean, in the rules of participation, some of the initial basic discussions that were held over there was, I mean, which could be the different levels of participation of different organizations in EOSC. I mean, and in the context of the EOSC association that has now been generated, and then. I mean, like the problem that we had at that point in time from that group was that the recommendations were extremely simple. I mean, they were only like a few indications of what could be the different levels of participation or rules that people could have. Now there is a better document that you can also access from the list of documents in the EOSC Secretariat, where you will be able to get further details. In fact, I mean, I was reading recently the document. I think that, I mean, it has improved quite a lot. And then, I mean, like, probably we would have changed a couple of things in the current document that we have as well, yeah, in that sense. Mm.
Oh, great. Also, there's a question from Timia asking, is there a set of recommendations directly targeting organizations?
Not really. I mean, not really. If you go then later on into the other different layers, so I mean, like, we wanted to keep the organizational interoperability part like very generic, because it was mostly focusing on how all the organizations can interact with each other. If now you go into the specific organizations and there are recommendations for them, then in principle you have to go to the other ones, to the other parts, yeah, to the technical, semantic, and legal recommendations, because those are all the places where we go into the details of how you have to handle, I mean, your users, authentication and authorization and so on, yeah, using the typical core services, how you have to handle metadata and how much metadata you have to consider, how you have to ensure the long-term sustainability of your services, and finally, how you have to deal with all the legal problems or issues that may appear in the context of, I mean, maintaining data sets. The data set becomes orphan, and so on and so forth. So the actual recommendations for an organization that is providing services are coming in the other layers. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And what's been the take up from the organizations involved in here?
So for the time being, I mean, like, this document has served as an input for the strategic research and innovation agenda, which is more or less like setting the next steps that have to be followed. There is a specific item in the research innovation agenda on organizational interoperability, which is just based on this and rules of participation. And I mean, for the time being, we are now in the process of identifying which will be the next working groups and the next steps to be followed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in my specific case, for instance, we digging out a little bit more on the semantic interoperability part, yeah, because that was one where we were really like going into more details, identifying the types of services and resources that were needed. And this one will go into those areas. I mean, there will be a specific area of work that is more focused on rules of participation as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Timio, did you have a question to ask? Do you want to unmute yourself?
Mm-hmm.
I just meant to ask if you know of anything like that coming up in the future, but you've actually answered that question. So thank you very much. That's very useful. Great job on it. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Thank you, Oscar. Hope you can hang around for the rest of the session and
yes.
with 5 minutes. All right. So next we've got Priyanka Pillai from Australia. So Priyanka is part of the Melbourne Data Analytics Platform, and is heavily involved in the RDA's COVID-19 documents, recommendations. So Priyanka is going to talk about inequalities in data, lessons learned from the pandemic. So Priyanka, over to you.
Thanks, Kieran. I don't think I can share my slides. So if you can share my slides, I'll still haven't fixed it.
No worries. Let me try get your slides up on here. Rolling. All right, here we go.
Thanks, Kieran. And apologies for the couple of seconds delay. I tried sharing my slide yesterday, it didn't work. And I think the backup really works when someone else has it. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me to present at this session. And I'm quite excited to be talking about inequities in data. And a lot of things I have said in my other talks as well in the last year or so, but I'm trying to put a more social aspects and people element to this talk. I'm presenting virtually from Melbourne, Australia, as Kieran said. And before I start my presentation, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And also extend my respects to any Indigenous people who may be virtually present with us here today. So I'll be talking about inequities in data and the lessons learned from the ongoing pandemic, which also includes some positive examples of how social dynamics and bridges enabled and also empowered the response. Can we go to the next slide, please, Kieran? So these are my contact details, and quickly about the organizations that I work for. So I work part-time I work full-time as an academic specialist at the University of Melbourne for 2 organizations. So I work part-time for Melbourne Data Analytics Platform, a multidisciplinary group of data specialists who collaborate with researchers across various disciplines on data-intensive research. And then I wear my second hat and I work part-time for the Australian Partnership for Preparedness Research on Infectious Disease Emergencies. It's a Centre for Research Excellence funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council here in Australia. And this network involves a wide network of experts involved in medical, scientific, public health, and ethics research. And a lot of those experts, including some of the sort of cross-cutting people who work across data collaboration, they're based at the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity in Melbourne. And all the groups that I work for is based at the University of Melbourne. And those are my contact details of the organizations that I work for. So please feel free to drop me an email if you want to chat after this session. Can we go to the next slide, please, Kieran? So infectious diseases surveillance, this is an interesting, not a definition, but a summary of what the big data ecosystem looks like. And this was way before the pandemic actually happened. And it makes so much sense as we work more and more in this space. So infectious disease surveillance is one of the most exciting opportunities created by big data, because these novel data streams can improve timeliness and spatial and temporal resolution and provide access to hidden populations. These streams can also go beyond disease surveillance and provide information on behaviors, outcomes related to vaccine or drug use. However, the promise of these big data streams must be balanced. And we all know that's true, and it comes with a lot of challenges and barriers as well. Can we move to the next slide, please? This was one of the more challenging talks for me to write because I come from a very technical, health and science-focused background, but I'm hoping to touch upon some social elements of data that empowers preparedness for and response towards pandemics. My talk will briefly touch upon interoperability in this space, because we've talked about interoperability in so many contexts, but then in this diverse data ecosystem, what does that actually mean, and how realistic is it to expect interoperability in different settings? And I'll also talk about how social infrastructure has driven response through, and I'll talk about a couple of examples, not going into too much details about the project, but also looking at it from a slightly positive aspect. And I'll also talk about forming a community of practice, and I'll be plugging a bit of work that I've been doing. And I've also ran a session yesterday, so I'll talk about an infectious diseases data community of practice as well. Next slide, please. So interoperability, it's a term that's used quite a bit, and it's a very technical term as well if we just focus on how the data is captured, what is done to the data, and the analytics side of things. But what does interoperability look like when there's humans involved, when there are people involved, when there is a purpose to which the data is collected? What does it look like from that perspective? Next slide, please. So the basic definition of interoperability is being able to exchange and make use of information, which is the first definition that pops up on Google. And there's a reason why I pick that up, because that's how most people look at interoperability. But does the purpose for which the information is collected, the purpose for which the information is processed, does that change, and does that impact interoperability? And what about the reuse of that information? What about the system that captures that information? To what extent can systems be extended and be modified and changed beyond the purpose for which they were designed to ensure interoperability? I don't have the answer to that. It's just a question. Next slide, please. Social bridges for pandemic preparedness and response. And like I said, there was a lot of conversation about the technical, the data definitions, the analytical tools, all the methods that are being used, big data, the size of data, the movement of data. But I try to focus a little bit on social bridges in this talk, and then leave us with some food for thought. Next slide, please. So this is the infectious diseases data ecosystem. And again, this is a slide that I've presented across different talks here in RDA and other forums. And as we are talking, as we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, this data ecosystem it's growing in every way. It's growing in terms of depth, it's growing in terms of breadth, it's growing in terms of volume. And there is a lot that's going on. But I've just added some examples here to highlight the diversity of this data ecosystem. There are case report forms, administrative data sets, electronic health records, immunization data, epi data, public health reporting, diagnostics data coming from lab research, and thinking about vulnerable communities, the risk aspects, and the reporting that's being done on vulnerable communities, and how the planning is done for those vulnerable communities. So this highlights how diverse the data ecosystem is. Next slide, please. Why do we need to actively consider the social bridges and infrastructure? We've seen that pandemics are a multidisciplinary issue. It's not just a health problem, but it's a social problem. It's an economic problem. It affects education, employment, justice, everything. And that also highlights the diversity in the information system. So not just diversity from the health perspective, but also domain-specific, domain-related diversity. And timeliness is the key. The speed at which the information moves, the speed at which people have access to this information, that is the key to response. And partnerships enable not just timeliness, but also accuracy. And there's local as well as international implications, because pandemics are not restricted to a geographical setting. There's localized implication, and it also has international implications. And we need to drive the dialogue for the practitioners, because the practitioners are too busy responding. They cannot be the ones driving the message that we need to consider social bridges and infrastructure while they're trying to save people's lives. And there is a need for knowledge base and people who contribute to that knowledge base, because there is so much information being generated by the minute. Not everyone knows where everything is. Next slide, please. Of data empowering a pandemic response. Next slide, please. So I've broadly classified some key elements here, and I'll be talking about some real life projects that I've been involved in, mainly highlighting the human and the social elements in those projects. So partnerships between researchers and government. We've seen it in the media, we've seen it in literature, how researchers are actively working with policymakers and government, and how that has a proportional response in those jurisdictions, and what happens when there is active flow of information between government and researchers, which in the context of public health and infectious diseases happens during routine research as well. It's not restricted to just a pandemic, but I think the strengthening of those partnerships is the key, and not siloing and not looking at policymakers as someone that are external and they're just signing papers, but they're actively involved in drawing the knowledge out of research. Openness has highlighted how important the availability of information. When I say information, it doesn't just include raw data or say genomics data that's openly shared, or the epi information that's openly shared, but any kind of information that can be shared openly, and I'm careful when I'm saying that, that is driving the response. And the human elements of tools and technologies, where I will talk about some of the projects that I'm involved in. There's one particular project that we worked on where there was active partnership between researchers and government, and we were trying to do a public health research partnership project. But at that point, the realization was that the public health responders are driving the public health elements of the research. What about the research elements? There's different information that's being collected for research purposes, which not just focuses on the present day scenario, but also considers what the future looks like. So at that point, there's a difference in perspective, there's a difference in priorities, and there's a difference in the way which the data is collected. So how do you balance that? Can tools support it? Can technology support it? And yes, they can, but the people need to acknowledge the difference between those two streams, and how those streams can also interact with each other. When I say two streams, that's the public health and the research element of things. There are new tools that are developed for these kind of projects. And at that point, there is a lot of pressure on people to learn those new tools, understand how those two tools will actually work. There's huge amount of money put into infrastructure and tools, but what about the skills? What about people's comfort levels with these new tools and technology while there is a pandemic that's ongoing? Do we think about that? Do we think about analytical methods, the skills, the training that are required to use those analytical methods? And also the implication of the information that goes in, the implication of the differences in information that goes into those methods. If a number goes from 10 to 20, I'm being very simplistic here, what implication does that have when the analytical methods process those numbers? What implication does that have on the response when those numbers are crunched? And what is the proportionality of that one number towards response? And what are the priorities of the practitioners? Do practitioners want to go through heaps of text online to find the latest resource, or do they want things represented visually? This was another project that I was involved in, where I was one of the health informatics consultants, and we spoke to general practitioners and other public health practitioners, and there was a need for a visual representation of data, not just on hospital settings, but also on diagnostic tests. What are the testing guidelines? What are the border measures right now? So at that point, the practitioners don't have the time to go and look up things online. They need everything in a visual format. What is stopping us from doing that? It's not the lack of technology. Dashboards can be built quite quickly, but understanding and the acknowledgement that this is the way the information needs to be presented. That's where technology is not a problem. It's an ongoing dialogue that needs to happen and needs to include practitioners. And social indicators of health. And it's a very epi-focused discussion, and I'm not an epidemiologist, I should say that, but there are some people experiencing a high burden of disease. Do we know why? There are some regions that are experiencing a high burden of disease. Do we know enough? Do we know why? Next slide, please. And this is where I'll plug in the community of practice discussion and the initiative that I'm leading along with two other active RDA members. Next slide, please. I should have mentioned this in my introduction. I was one of the co-chairs for the RDA COVID-19 working group, and I had the opportunity to work with some fantastic members of the RDA community and stakeholders where we could draft a series of recommendations and guidelines. And at that point, there was active discussion on where to next. This is focused on COVID-19, what happens after this? So at that point, the idea of this infectious diseases data community of practice was discussed because we've seen past health emergencies and ongoing health emergency has demonstrated the challenges associated with sharing information. The crisis has highlighted the importance of a coordinated response, but also reinforced the need to have a global community of practice. So this community of practice should enable the development of social and technical infrastructure that can be adapted locally to expedite the collection, sharing, and reuse of data. And this community of practice is meant to augment the work of RDA COVID-19. And I shall post my case statement here because it's open for a mini community feedback. So if you can read my statement after this session, when people finish the session, that'll be great. And please feel free to post comments or reach out to me if you need to have a chat. Next slide, please. So quickly, what will this infectious diseases data community of practice try and achieve? So center people around this community of practice, identify key international and local leaders and change agents who understand what we're trying to do here and want to drive this initiative. Priorities, identify the key priorities in the infectious diseases research community as well as infectious diseases practitioner community. Scope the data definition systems, tools, and analytical methods that are not just supporting ongoing research and peacetime, as they say, but also supports the pandemic. And this community of practice aims to be an enabler that will build a global framework that can facilitate dialogues, be an aggregator of information, build a knowledge base, and try and develop sort of an umbrella organization or a framework that can be adapted to localized settings, because as we've seen, there's a lot of diversity even within the same country when it comes to, say, jurisdictional laws or types of data that's being collected or definitions. So things need to be adapted to local settings. Next slide, please. It's the same. I think I've got another slide. Yeah. So I try and close on this note always, that we as humans, we need to make better decisions for the data that we have in hand, so that data can make better decisions for us. So it's important to break out of silos. There's immense value in combining information from different systems. Acknowledge the diversity of people that are at the center of data and the diversity they bring to the data as well. There also need to be a clear understanding of the value for collaborating and sharing data, whether it's the incentive-driven discussion, whether it's the carrot or the stick, but that has to be established why people need to collaborate and share data. And trust, that's really important as well. And we need to build capacity in terms of skills, people, time, funding, collaborations during preparedness stage for better response. Next slide, please. And that's where I'll end my talk. I do like to keep the credits for the presentation template because they're such pretty presentations, so it's there. But there's also my details. There's my email address and my Twitter handle. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, or please post them in the chat now if you'd like to discuss. If I have time, that is. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyanka. That was great. There was a few questions that came up on the chat and the Q&A. So I might start with Lars. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
See here. So I was wondering, since you were working in this area, the concept of the trust gap, where you find it, kind of, do you have an idea of how to use social bridging to affect this trust gap that exists in sensitive data to enable data interoperability?
So I can give two examples. So I can give two examples. So one that focuses on engaging with vulnerable communities and gaining the trust and co-designing the process of preparedness and response with vulnerable communities, as opposed to the othering that usually is done, that this is a vulnerable community, we don't need to talk to them, but we will do the research for them. So getting rid of that thought process and making sure that the community engagement is strong before a pandemic happens, and understanding what the priorities of those vulnerable communities and populations are. That's one example. Again, what I work on, but this is what my colleagues work on, and we actively learn from what they're doing, and we then incorporate that into the data as well. That when we're collecting data, we don't want to be the outsiders going into vulnerable settings, vulnerable populations, and saying, hey, we're here to collect your data, without actually talking to them at first. The other example would be setting up citizen juries and understanding the priorities of medical interventions, very broadly speaking. So if it's vaccines, again, talking about some fantastic work that's being done in the consortium that I work for, vaccine prioritization, talking to community stakeholders, asking them what their perspectives are, and establishing the common understanding of priorities. Who is a priority population? Who should get the vaccines first? So those conversations and those workshops have happened before the pandemic happened here, which enabled to prioritize populations faster, because those conversations have already happened before. So I would see those two things: engagement and understanding priorities and the level of vulnerabilities that we want to take into account when there's any medical intervention that's applied, or a public health response that's applied. Did that answer your question?
Well, sort of, yes, but also I was thinking more on the level between research organizations or hospitals and research organizations. I quite often find that there is a lack of trust between different organizations when they are interacting with each other. So one organization don't want to release their data because they don't trust that the other organization has the proper way of handling their data and so on. And this gap exists between researcher and organization, and between organization and organization. And I was wondering if there was any work in that area that you've come across.
I think the best example would be the institute that I work for, the Dowry Institute, which was funded on the principle of combining public health service and research. So they put immunologists and epidemiologists who are across the government and research, they put them all in the same building, which is not the way to collaborate, that you're in the same physical space. But they also then had joint appointments. They had projects where researchers could work with those epidemiologists in the government, and they could inform each other. So I think that's the other question that Timia has asked, what a few examples of agents of change that has to come from top down. Again, this is my personal experience and my personal opinion. It has to come from top down, funding opportunities, government actively driving that discussion that, researchers, you need to talk to these public health practitioners, you need to know what is going on in the research. So thinking of joint appointments, people working across both sectors, funding people jointly, bringing together infrastructure for people, projects, universities also acknowledging that we need to step out of our boundaries and actually talk to people who are sitting in the government departments, talking to COVID patients and collecting their data on a daily basis. We can't just be sitting in our little space, which is not a little space, it's a big space, but we need to talk to each other.
Thank you. That was a good answer.
Thanks, Lars. Kieran, I think the next person can go now. I don't think we have anything else.
Kieran disappeared.
Oh.
Do you want me, this is Claudia, good morning, hi, or whatever, it's good evening for you. Do you want me to read the next Q&A question to you, or what? You can see
I think I can see, I can see the question. I think briefly touched upon it as, agents of change. It has to be a top-down sort of approach where there's enough funding and there's enough incentives given to people who want to collaborate, who want to be change agents. And RDA is an example of agents of change as well, bringing infectious diseases data management at the forefront and trying to support the building of a community of practice. That's being a change agent, acknowledging that there is a need to do that. The European Commission asking RDA to get a bunch of people together and draft recommendations and guidelines on RDA on COVID-19 data sharing. That was being an agent of change as well, because that brought together hundreds of people, experts across different domains who gave their valuable contributions to the document.
I can confirm that Kieran's network has died, so I'm just going to step in and guide the conversation. Tima, did you have a comment, question?
No, I actually, no, that makes very much sense, Priyanka, and thank you for the additional details on that. I was just wondering if these agents of change in any way have been addressed. Is there like sort of I mean, I assume that there's a literature on it. I was just wondering if there's any quick access set of resources that we can look at for this. I'm also looking at it from for a different work that we're doing for the EASC and additional things on science communication, and I was actually very much interested in like the concept of agents of change in general. So also for data sharing and for yeah. But you gave a quite diverse examples. I'm not sure if there's such a resource anywhere. Thank you.
I would have a question if there's no more. There are no more speakers, because I don't know what the program is.
Yeah, so Claudia, I see that you did have a question in the chat. We do have another speaker about a 30-minute workshop.
So I better, yeah, just let the other speaker speak. Yeah, I think it's better, don't you?
Okay, thanks so much, Claudia. But we'll save the chat and we can keep this as a discussion later.
Oh, because I just have a very good example, but I can tell Priyanka or whatever afterwards. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I'm here.
Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Priyanka. That was excellent. Kieran is back on board, I believe. Kieran, are you here? He's around. But we've got Hannah up next. Here he is. So, hey, Kieran, welcome back. I'm going to jump off and I'm going to let Hannah have my spot on the screen.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes. Okay. So my name is Hannah. Nice to meet everyone virtually. I'm a PhD candidate from University of Science and Technology in South Korea and researcher from Korea Institute of Science and Technology Information. First, I will briefly introduce the background of my ongoing PhD research, and then we will proceed to interaction activities and discussion. So you might ask that how or if the current global health crisis has affected the open science domain generally. Open science is not a very new concept and movement, but there always were some skeptical policymakers and researchers who didn't see enough benefits to allocate resources and implement this concept systematically. And the current pandemic has clearly showed to everyone why open science is important for both emergency and non-emergency situations. And open science significance have been explicitly acknowledged by many international and national institutions during the pandemic. For example, there were joint calls initiated by Wellcome Trust, UNESCO, WHO for strengthening international scientific cooperation through open science. And we can see that a variety of open science practices have been amplified indeed throughout the pandemic. These are increased number of open access and preprint publications, open data and open code sharing, open peer review, open research collaborative projects, and all these practices, we can see that they had their positive impact on general response to coronavirus. For example, very early and quick preprint sharing informed therapeutic interventions such as airway management and helped identify thrombosis risk in COVID patients. But what we can also see is that according to Australian professor Paul Glasgow, sloppy science and research waste have been also amplified during the pandemic with time pressures and inadequate research infrastructures. The most infamous example of such problem is a scandal around hydroxychloroquine in the treatment of COVID patients, when a low-quality clinical trial led to a strong scientific climb proved to be wrong later. And all this demonstrates the urgent need to improve research integrity through open science by making the whole research process more open and transparent. However, the current pandemic, despite some positive things to open science, it also showed, highlighted some problems, such as that many national research systems capacities are not being able to incorporate open science in all stages of research. Also, there are lack of equal opportunities to benefit from open science across countries, across regions, and there is also improper alignment between open science policies on the one hand, and on the other hand, the system of evidence-based policymaking, emergency preparedness, and response. And we should also acknowledge that many open science efforts in the context of pandemic, despite how great they are, they're just a temporary response, and they do encourage structural change of the research culture to be initiated for resilient and sustained open science ecosystem. On the slide, you can see the research design. Hopefully, see the research design of my current PhD project. The ultimate aim is to build a conceptual model of open science ecosystem development with the capacity to respond in public health emergencies. And since this ongoing project, I'm currently completed the stage 3, just like expert interviewers. And here you can see like my sample consisted of 36 people from different international and national institutions such as research institutes, universities, clinical centers, information service providing organizations, publishers, funders, and the majority of interviewees had research or job responsibilities related to COVID-19 or similar emergencies. As I mentioned before, the final expected outcome is a conceptual model of open science ecosystem development, which will be able to serve as a conceptual instrument to plan, assess the maturity of, and recommend improvements to national open science policies and practices. The focus is on monitoring and continuous improvement of open science ecosystem. As a design of this model is based on institutional analysis and development framework of Eleanor Ostrom, is an American researcher, which is appropriate for analysis of different types of shared resources, so like knowledge as a shared resource. Now we will move to interaction activities. And please let us get to know each other. And please, I will share your link. Please tell me which country are you living in currently. Wait a few. No, everyone responded yet. I see. The result is here: Australia, Finland, Australia, France, UK. 19 people here. Many people from Australia. Nice. 20 respondents here. Netherlands. So many people from Europe, and maybe most of them from, and most people from Australia. Okay, let's proceed to next slide. Just a second. Please proceed to this another link. What is your main job? Like, who are you? Researcher, librarians? Who are you? Next. Researcher, how many? ICT specialist, IT specialist. Wow, probably the most of them. Librarian, many people. And other. Interesting. If you if you put others, please type in chat like who is, what is your position, please, and we will check later. Okay. And I want to share with you some of my findings, primarily gathered from based on expert interviews. And here's the factors which can enable or inhibit open science practices. They categorize into 4 groups. First, the contextual or external. Next one, institutional regulatory factors, resource related, and individual and motivational. The last group is kind of researchers' perceptions. And I would ask you first to rank all factors within each group according to the amount of the importance they might have on open science. And please consider your particular country, like situation in your country. Just a second. I will copy a link. Please proceed to next link. And you should activate up and down arrows, just one click, and you can see, you can move these blocks like down, or just up. And please don't forget to submit your response. It's very easy. I will come back to the next slide.
Hannah, just to be clear, what did you want us to rank these, and what we see is most important in order?
Yes. Which issues affect, you think, to open science, development of open science system?
Yeah.
I will go back again. So like factors which can drive open science development, or just inhibit or enable open science, according to like what issues you think like most important, like first place, just like the most important, and accordingly. Okay. Oh, we can see academic freedom, culture, national culture. Interesting. Scientific globalism. I will give you a bit more time just to complete this stage. No, scientific globalism first. I think are you happy to proceed to next slide? Everybody completed, I think so, right? Oh no, some people are still doing this because it's moving. Okay. Maybe a few seconds more and we'll proceed to another one. We will come back to this top rank factors later for discussion. Okay, I think we will proceed to next one. Next group is institutional and regulatory factors. The same approach. Which is more influential. And please, you can see one here. Just in order to see the full text, you should double click like this. Oh, we can see results here. Research career evaluation and reward system is just leading position. Okay. Two leading positions, condition of research, openness as condition of research funding, and research career evaluation and reward system. Yeah. Just a second. I think everybody completed. If not, please send a message in our chat if somebody is not ready. I think we should proceed to the next one. So, we will come back to this later. Next, resource related. Just a second. I sent link. Please check. So just one person. Digital infrastructures, skill training, two leading positions. Digital infrastructures, skill training. Who will be the winner? Digital infrastructures. I think digital infrastructure probably will be the winner. Okay. I think we should move to another one. As a last group, just a second. of the last group, please rank the same approach. Here the winner is digital infrastructures. Researcher perceived efforts. Okay. Very clear, it seems very clear position for researchers' perceived efforts. Maybe few seconds more and we will finish this part. Okay, it seems just 1 second. Let's check. Just one more. Okay. So now we will proceed to interaction part, discussion part. Let us discuss like 4 factors, like top ranked factors from each group. And the question is, can you recommend any actions to address a factor, or can you give any example of best practices or initiatives? I mean, just action to avoid some barriers and facilitate open science development. And we have 3 channels for discussion. First, not chat, but Q&A tab. You should type and everybody can give likes, like if you share a common opinion. Second, just unmute yourself. And the last option, I will send a link to Google document. If you can also, I encourage you to contribute. Yeah. So first factor, first group, it's a contextual group factors, academic freedom. So most of you think that academic freedom culture very important affect open science development. Why do you like how you address this factor? This is the question. Oh, many. Can you give a few examples?
Yeah, it might help to get some examples. Just, Hannah, just letting you know, we've got about 9 minutes in the session there. I think there are questions here, but I mean, let us discuss. Can you recommend how we can address do you think academic freedom is an enabler or inhibitor for open science? Why do you think, and can you recommend something for this? And again, you can unmute yourself. You can type in Google document, or you can just give your opinion in Q&A section. So Hannah, could you get the slides back up there, the diagram, so we got that to think through? A few
this
slides.
Diagram, all of them with doing this?
Yeah, I think that would be useful. So these are the factors that that you've identified as yeah. So I think we had Robin. Did you want to unmute yourself and comment there, Robin?
First, we are talking about academic freedom culture because most of you ranked very high. That's very influential.
Hi. So first I asked the question how academic, before this slide, I was curious how academic freedom affects open science. Is that in a negative way or a positive way? And then when you asked for input, I thought of a positive way, that researchers would have the freedom to choose, for example, open infrastructures over some more like proprietary systems if they didn't have academic freedom to choose their methods and their services. So if they're more enlightened than their institution, they would be able to, about open science, they'd be able to choose those methods. But I think maybe some people had negative things in mind too, that academic freedom would allow people not to choose routes to open science. So I'm not sure if I'm on the right path there, but that was my thought.
But in general, do you think it's like more positive or more negative for open science? For example, countries which have very strong academic freedom culture, is it good for them to develop open science system?
Yes, I hope so. I'm redrafting our university research data policy, and I'm making a link with academic. Does have a positive correlation.
Thank you so much, very much. Kiran, are you here? Should we move to discuss another factor, which is top ranked?
I think given the time constraints, if you don't mind, Hannah, it'd be nice to just open up the discussion for general discussion.
To check the typed questions or answers. Academic freedom allows researchers who are more knowledgeable to choose their own methods, services.
I think if we just open up the floor to any questions, whether it's from Hannah's one or from any of the other sessions, that'd be good. We just about 5 minutes left in the session, I think.
Oh, we also see we can see some input here in Google document.
Yeah. Okay.
For academic freedom.
Robin, was that did you have a question there, or?
I think it takes time to.
There was a little bit of a mistake, but because I clicked on and then changed my mind. But his opinion about how academic freedom affects open science.
My opinion, I think, of course, researchers should be independent from government order, so it's positively academic freedom effects. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to have mandatory open science policies to oblige researchers to do something. So you need not to oblige them, but you should persuade them. You should show them, demonstrate benefits, why open science is beneficial for them, and in such a way, but not say just you must do it. Because in Europe, for example, in countries like Netherlands, for example, they really want to see why it's beneficial for me. But maybe in Asian countries, which I'm living in, maybe it's more space to oblige researchers because it's like more government system, not much academic freedom. So it's, of course, it depends on a country, but in general, I think it should be a collaboration between like researchers and like kind of Ministry of Sciences, government bodies. But you cannot oblige researchers to do what they don't want to do, because it's science. It's independent from government. Okay. maybe let us move to another one. Because we have still limited time. Next group is institutional and regulatory factors, and the top factor is openness as a condition of research funding. So it's like funders require you to open your outputs and data according to grant conditions. The same question, just can you give some very good examples, or just what is the problems, how to address these problems?
I might give a response to that one, Hannah. I think that's having that as a condition is really useful and is a starting point. But some of the challenges that end up happening is where do the researchers put that? You need to it needs to be backed up by either the institutional or national infrastructures that allow them to make the data open. Having that expectation, the onus of making it open just on the researcher is difficult, because they don't having it open and fair requires a fair bit of infrastructure and capability behind that, which is generally not at the researcher's disposal unless it's available to them through institutions or other means. Yeah.
And I would also like to add that these days increasingly we can see that funders, they have kind of in their grant conditions requirements, or just mandatory or rather encouraging that researchers should open their data or research outputs, but they're not very helpful if the funders doesn't have compliance mechanisms, compliance procedures. So how they can check, like to be sure that researchers submitted fair, findable, accessible, reusable, interoperable data. So like they should check, the processes should check this. I think so. Let us see people opinion maybe. It's an example of Australian research.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask Hannah in there is that you had what was it, the multi-stakeholder partnerships and coalitions as part of that. What was that meant to? What did you come up with that in your research?
Do you mean multi-stakeholder coalitions? Do you mean this one, right? With multi-stakeholder partnerships coalitions. I mean, just these coalitions for exactly developing open science ecosystem. And in my opinion, I found like two good examples in France and in Netherlands. In France, for example, it calls just a second, Open Science Committee. It's a partnership of Ministry of Research and Higher Education, also some research institutes, some data providers, and so on. And the similar in the Netherlands, like Dutch Coalition of Open Science. And they together develop open science according to the National Plan of Open Science. So it's a very consistent, systematic approach. They have national plan, national strategy of open science. They have body of different stakeholders, and they collaborate together. I mean this.
All right. Look, we're past our time, so I think we need to bring the session to a wrap. So thank you very much, Hannah, for that very useful work. Really looking forward to seeing the end result of all this, and hopefully we can all benefit from your insights.
Sorry, Kiran, I think if you are limited to time, we can send participants later on by email to email the results of our voting interaction session, right?
Yes, certainly we'll make all of this
summary of results, right?
Yeah. I think Timmy has just put on the comments that there is similar things in Ireland, North so on.
So many interesting response, but we don't have time, unfortunately, to discuss all of them.
Unfortunately, we don't. Thank you everyone who participated in this session. If you are interested in joining the interest group, please do so either on the RDA website, or if you want to indicate that on the shared notes, we'll add you in. So going forward, the intention is to try and build this body of knowledge, and we'll have to in future sessions start to look at how we bring all of this together into some sort of digestible way. Once again, thank you all for joining, and if you got any other thoughts or comments, please feel free to add that into the shared notes.